Our next order of business is H.R. 1512, Social Security Child Protection Act. And I recognize Mr. Marchant for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for considering this very important piece of legislation, and the whole committee for recognizing how important protecting a child's Social Security number can be. So, a few years ago, I had a frantic call from a constituent one morning. She had just recently had a baby and was expecting the Social Security card for that baby to be in the mail. Very much to their dismay, they found out that there had been a ring of people going and removing mail from mailboxes in the community. And in fact, after several weeks of investigation, the Postal Office and the local authorities discovered a whole pile of mail in the possession of a convicted felon. In that pile of mail was this child's, less than a year-old child's, Social Security number. So we began to work on this issue. Mr. Johnson had some hearings in Plano. We had hearings, several hearings on this, and we had never been able to secure the cooperation of the Social Security Administration in making a ruling that something like this, if it happened, would be able, the Social Security number would be able to be replaced. Most people don't realize it, but many children have their identity stolen and do not realize it for many years, because a child usually does not start using their Social Security number till age 13 or 14 when they get their first job. So it's a this child's Social Security number is easy pickings for criminals to go out and use for years. And in fact, some children's parents find out that their identity has been stolen, and they've been working jobs at age 7 and 8. And so it's obvious that they have had their identity stolen. I'd like to thank Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett was an original co-sponsor on this bill. This bill basically says that if the parent can prove that the Social Security number was stolen or in the U.S. mail system, that the Social Security Administration would be obligated at that point to issue a new card to the parent and to the child. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Marchant. I now recognize Mr. Doggett for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I mainly want to acknowledge the initiative that Mr. Marchant took on this measure. I think it's a constructive measure. A number of years ago, I authored and passed through the House a measure concerning the removal of this information on Medicare. The Senate never acted. Mr. Johnson picked that bill up the next session, and we worked together. And finally, after years, I think in May or June, the Social Security Administration, Medicare folks finally got together, and the cards start coming out to seniors to try to protect their privacy. And what Mr. Marchant did was to identify another area that's important to protect privacy for our children. I note that Carnegie Mellon did a study that said that nearly 10% of children have had their identity stolen, and that's significantly higher actually than for adults. I think children are particularly vulnerable to this practice, and I salute Mr. Marchant for recognizing that, and I'm pleased to join him in supporting this legislation. Children and their parents and their guardians acting on their behalf deserve this streamlined process that will allow for a child to be issued a new Social Security card, Social Security number and card long before any misuse occurs. No child should have to wait for the inevitable harm to come of their identity being stolen before they can take action. Building on the success that we've had for seniors, we now, through Mr. Marchant's bill, work to ensure on a bipartisan basis that we provide the same type of protection for infants and children from these baseless identity thieves Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Dodd. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1512. The objection measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. The objection amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Now turn to Amy Shewart, the Staff Director for Social Security Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Shewart. Can you hit that microphone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1512 seeks to protect children under the age of 14 from the effects of identity theft by requiring the Social Security Administration to issue a new Social Security number to any child under the age of 14 when that child's Social Security card has been stolen while being mailed to his or her address. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes technical and clarifying changes, including creating an effective date for the bill of 180 days following enactment. Chairman Brady, that concludes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Shewart. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Schweikert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is just a comment, compliment, and some appreciation both to the bill sponsors, being the father of a 2.5-year-old. I do want, though, as this conversation moves forward, this legislation accomplishes substantially what you're after. But I will tell you, I believe that there's also some technology solutions in a distributive ledger model, blockchain model, that would actually, we need to start thinking about moving forward a mechanism for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans, all these where we have identifying numbers. Because if it's maybe Social Security fraud for my 2-year-old daughter, and stealing that number, but also we see that there's fraud in medical services and other types of identifiers out there. And there is some technology that can rotate and blind the number and may be more universal across all these types of services that exist in our society. So I'd like us to think that accomplish this, but also we need to all be getting together and looking for a technology solution that takes us into the future. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Johnson, recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I first want to thank my fellow Texas colleagues, Mr. Marchant and Mr. Doggett, for their work on this important legislation. This bill is just common sense. Children who have their Social Security card and number stolen before it even gets to them deserve to be able to get a new number, and this will help these youngest of victims of identity theft. It's the right thing to do. I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense legislation. But, colleagues, the fact is that this doesn't fix the real problem. It's time to have a serious conversation about the use of Social Security numbers. Remember, the original purpose of these numbers was to track earnings for the purpose of determining Social Security benefits. As we know, these numbers are used for everything in the world nowadays. Mr. Chairman and colleagues, the American people deserve nothing less than having a serious conversation about the Social Security number, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Ms. Black, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is such an important issue with having 6 grandchildren. I am acutely aware that we have to protect these children. The FTC, the lead agency, federal agency on identity theft, this is amazing, reported 400,000 complaints of identity theft in 2017 alone. And almost 30% of those increases came from 2013. And the Social Security number, as we all know, has become an increasingly valuable target for identity theft due to its widespread use throughout the financial sector. Children are particularly vulnerable to Social Security theft because they do not work, drive, or establish credit, thereby extending the time an identity theft can misabuse the child's Social Security number before being noticed or causing harm. So currently, before a Social Security number can be issued, Social Security Administration policy requires that a person not only show that their Social Security number has been misused by the third party, but also that he or she was harmed by that misuse. And I'm proud to sponsor this bill that allows our young children to get a fresh start with a new Social Security number without having to be harmed by the misuse of a stolen Social Security number. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Black. Mr. Marchant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit for the record an article from The Hill entitled "Why Children Are Now Prime Targets for Identity Theft," and a letter from the Association of Mature American Citizens and AARP in support of this bill. Thank you.
Without objection. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1512 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 1512 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1512 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House.